Hello and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger and I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks and the co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of the entire Literature Berks committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of program. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. In the chat, you can see a link to purchase a signed copy of The First, the inside story of the Women Reshaping Congress, through our official book vendor, Reeds & Company Bookshop. Literature Berks is happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Remember that books always make great gifts. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat function. We will do our best to answer questions throughout the program. Our speaker tonight is Jennifer Steinhauer. She has covered high-profile beats in her 25-year reporting career at the New York Times, from City Hall bureau chief and Los Angeles bureau chief to Capitol Hill. She won the Newswoman Club of New York Front Page Deadline Reporting Award in 2006 for her reporting on Hurricane Katrina. She's written a novel about television business and 2 cookbooks. I'm honored to welcome Jennifer Steinhauer to Literature Berks.
Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Literature Berks, for having me and for supporting independent bookstores. That's really important at this time. As we all know, a lot of bookstores are really struggling, and so I'm always happy to see them in partnership with organizations doing events. So thank you for that. Again, obviously, we're here to talk tonight about my book, The Firsts, which is the story of the women who are reshaping Congress and who helped Democrats take back the gavel in the 116th Congress in the elections in 2018. And I think that talking about this book and those women is particularly relevant now, less than a week out from the election, for a couple reasons. One is the way they ran their campaigns and the issues that they ran on, and the way that they appealed to voters, particularly Democratic women appealing to voters in Republican areas, became somewhat of a template, even though it was completely shifted, obviously, by COVID-19, but it was somewhat of a template for what we saw play out in the Democratic primary for the White House and in this campaign. It's notable to me that of all these women who won, none of them lost a primary this year in 2020. And the vast majority of them are on track to win their races again. In any of the races where Democrats are in danger of losing their seats, I think the vast majority of those places, the Republican challengers who might prevail are women. So women are really so instrumental to what's happening in the House right now, particularly again on the Democratic side. And they certainly are very important voters, as we've seen their power in the 2018 midterms, and certainly we anticipate seeing it, particularly in the suburban areas in 2020. So the book sort of presages all that, if you will, and talks about a lot of these women. The idea for the book came about by my editor, Algonquin, Betsy Gleek, who right after the 2018 midterm elections called me and said that she was so fascinated by the fact that all these women had won, still not 25% of Congress, but still a record number. And so many of them were firsts. First Muslim women to join Congress, the first 2 Native American women to join Congress, in some places like Texas, the first 2 Latino women to join, many people who were the first Black women or Black person at all, or youngest person, or both, to win their districts. There was, of course, a lot of focus and interest in the beginning on the so-called squad, especially Andrea Ocasio-Cortez being the youngest woman to ever win a House seat, and obviously becoming a huge and increasing face and voice for the progressive end of her party. But at the same time, I think it was equally interesting to look at another group of women who are big stars in the book. They call themselves the badasses. In my mind, there's much of a squad. Those are the national security women, includes Chrissy Houlihan from the great state of Pennsylvania, as you know, a veteran herself. Other veterans like Mikey Sherrill from New Jersey, Elaine Luria, who was a Navy captain from Virginia, as well as Abigail Spanberger, and also from Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, who'd been served in the CIA and the DOD. national women with a lot of national security backgrounds, veterans and so forth, who really formed a tremendous bond during the campaign last time and became a really close group and had a lot of impact, I would say, legislatively, especially, and on the culture of the House. So you had a lot of different women. You had very new women who were the first time for their race or ethnic minority, coming to Congress for the first time. Younger women. You had the oldest woman in Donna Shalala, who'd been a cabinet secretary and then became a freshman House member from the state of Florida. You had all these aforementioned women who'd served in national security, highly qualified, really just amazing resumes. And you had women winning districts that women had not won before. So it was a very diverse and interesting group of women who came that year and who have been responsible for animating the 116th Congress in a lot of ways, and who become really, remarkably for freshmen beyond AOC, a lot of them really well known nationally. Katie Porter from Southern California, I think, is on everyone's radar. Ayanna Pressley from Boston, a member of the so-called Squad, really raised her profile as well. So it's really remarkable for freshmen, men or women, to have both so many responsibilities as they've had in Congress and to have such a high profile out in the world. It's really very unusual. Even the Watergate babies, which was probably the other big kind of raucous class that came after Watergate, didn't have as many levels of power legislatively and politically as this group has, and certainly not the national profile. Of course, there wasn't the social media back then to fuel a lot of it like we have now. So these are it's a really interesting group. I followed them for a year in Washington and back in their home cities and states, got to know them, watched them in action, watched their stumbles, watched their successes, and then went on to watch them try to prevail again, and some of them in pretty tough districts in 2020. So that's kind of the story of how the book came to be. And I'd be happy to chat with you, obviously, about any topics that are of interest to you. And I see there are questions both in the chat and the Q&A. So hopefully people will definitely weigh in with their own thoughts and questions, and we can have a conversation.
Thank you. The first question is super important. Please introduce your dog.
Oh, this is Howard. Howard used to live under a car. He's our COVID rescue dog. And there he is. He doesn't have a lot of purpose other than to sit in laps, but that's okay. He's been good company.
So you mentioned all the different minorities, racial and ethnic minorities that grew out of the 116th Congress. Can you talk about what are the circumstances that kind of led to these increases? Like why in 2018? Why was this possible?
Right. So if I could just go back a tiny bit in history, when I first got to Washington in 2010 was the end of that campaign, that midterm year. And that, as you all may remember, was the big Tea Party wave. And that was a huge change in Washington too, which set off the trajectory for the Republican Party that ultimately culminated in the presidency, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and kind of the real transformation of the Republican Party to be the party of Trump. So if you fast forward then to 2018, to these midterm elections, you were seeing people run for all different kinds of reasons along in the spectrum of things they were trying to be against within the Trump administration, if you will. But a lot of that was fueled by women who felt very inspired to run because of Trump, and not just because of women's issues and the way they felt that the president behaved toward women, but also even just on not feeling like they were well represented on the national security front, different reasons. So that was, I think, what brought out the breadth and depth of women. What was interesting in a lot of districts that were already held by Democrats is that you had a lot of these women prevail basically on the notion that those communities had not been as represented by people who looked or came from areas of those districts that were not necessarily ever represented by people in Congress. If you had a district that was majority white, but there was an immigrant neighborhood or Black neighborhood, they were kind of sort of marginalized in that broader conversation, even in these Democratic districts. So like Ayanna Pressley, she never argued that she was more liberal or have different policy ideas. She would, from her a longtime opponent, who a longtime incumbent, Capuano, she would just say, change can't wait. So it was really about attracting different types of voters and engaging them, and who were interested in folks who looked and brought a different perspective. But a lot of it, the flip side that I would say, and I think about someone like Sharice Davids from Kansas City, Kansas, one of the first Native American women, the first openly gay person to win a seat in the state of Kansas. And she's obviously very aligned with these issues, and that was a very important symbolic win, especially for Native American women. But she ran really on the same issue other people did, which is about healthcare. But she was a very relatable person, a very authentic person. And I think that her being Native American in some ways may have been an attraction for some voters, but I think in some ways it proves the other point, that they were just ready for more diverse candidates and much more open to it, because they really identify with the things she was running on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I thought was super interesting, I had this idea that like you get to Congress and there's like orientation, like you go to college and you kind of figure out your way, and there is an orientation, but you talk a lot in the book about that there's a lot of learning on the job, and that these women were really surprised that there was no handbook, there was no guide on to how to do the job. Could you kind of explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, and Chrissy Houlihan talked to me about that a lot. They said you get here and they spend a lot of time. Well, there was a lot of time, I will say, spent on issues around sexual harassment, because it was just the beginning, the Me Too movement, and they were really starting to pass legislation to codify things you would think would already be laws about inappropriate relationships and harassment and so forth. But mostly it's kind of like they would tell them how to sign up for health insurance, or, kind of these basic HR things, and not anything fundamental about these jobs, which, some women came and they'd been in the legislature, Rashida Tlaib had been in the Michigan legislature, for example. Most people didn't have a clue about how to do something arcane like write and pass a bill, which is all these, parliamentarian procedures and all this weird stuff. So they really were learning on the job something that's quite complicated. And I don't mean to suggest they didn't do it by themselves. Of course they had staff, but it's a hard thing to do. And then there's the fact that Congress is just this vast city, of its own. You have the US Capitol, but then you have all these office buildings everywhere and hearing rooms. And it's just a really hard place to physically learn. And I think all the women and the men too were really surprised by how much time they spent in their day just literally, running from place to place, traversing the miles of the Capitol in these sort of 15 and 20-minute increments. It's a very intense schedule created job.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that a lot of us forget, is how vast the Capitol really is, and getting from one place to another is quite the feat sometimes. Something else in the book that I found fascinating was sort of this old guard versus the new, and with Speaker Pelosi, like, this is the way it's always been done, and this group of women who came in and said, but we were brought here to bring change. And I think part of it, at least from my reading, was that they didn't understand the procedures maybe necessarily of how to things to do, but also, why is this the way that things are done? Do you want to kind of go into some of that?
Yeah, there is a definite combination of that, right? I mean, Congress is a place where seniority is everything. And that's kind of true about Washington. A lot of people succeed in Washington by dint of just sticking around. You hang around here long enough and you'll eventually usually get a better job. You hang around Congress long enough and your party's in power, all of a sudden you're a committee chairperson. So that's, seniority is everything. And that was something that a lot of the women chafed at, because they thought, well, wait a minute, you wouldn't even be here in power, Nancy Pelosi, again, you Democrats, if it weren't for us. We won in this big wave election. We took all these Republican seats. We did it our way. And sometimes the party didn't even support us in a crowded primary. And we did our own thing. We used social media. We used small donor money, very contrary to how you guys are used to doing things. And now you're telling us to go sit down. They didn't care for that at all. But you're also right, that there was a learning curve, and they did things that were disruptive, and it's at times counterproductive to the goals of Nancy Pelosi and the party when they first got there, especially, in trying to face off with the Trump administration, knowing how to play the game and how to kind of pull those levers of rules and procedure is important. It's part of it. It's boring, but it's super part of it. As you can see, the results of the fact that we have a new Supreme Court justice. Why do we have that? Because the procedures and the rules around how you vote in the Senate used to be you needed 60 senators to do that. And they changed the rules and procedures during the Kavanaugh era to prepare for his confirmation, so that was no longer required. They lowered the number. So procedures and procedures and how things are done is kind of seems arcane and boring to people, but it can have tremendous policy impacts. So that's a lot of stuff to learn. And I think they felt like, hey, you need to learn it before you try to run the place. And the other thing I would say is, and this is kind of specific to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, though not exclusively, is that they came in and said, you know, we won primaries and we took out Democrats who've been around for a long time and are not as progressive as us. And maybe we'll start setting our sights on you. And that was very disruptive and upsetting to a lot of their colleagues. So that was just kind of a new thing.
Yeah, understandably so. Along those lines of getting the women elected, Judith asked the question, what impact did groups such as Emily's List have in electing these women?
So it's super interesting that you ask that, because generally speaking, Emily's List is incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful. And there are other reasons, certainly, but it's one of the reasons that Republican women have not made. Republican women have actually lost ground, even as Democratic women have been gaining more and more seats in Congress and in state legislatures and so forth. For the last decade, Republican women have really lost ground. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I actually have a chapter devoted to that in the book. But one thing definitely I would cite is there is no equivalent for Emily's List for Republican women. The party has not invested specifically in electing women. And Emily's List raises a ton of money. They're super powerful. They get involved in primaries sometimes they don't, but they can really make or break someone in terms of money. What's really interesting is when I was talking to someone from Emily's List, about a lot of the candidates in their initial research of my book, I had asked about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and they said, oh, she didn't want anything to do with us. She kind of perceived us as sort of the old white lady organization, and not at all, to establishment, and not at all how she wanted to do things. She wanted to raise all her money on small dollar donations. So even that's really interesting in how things are slowly changing. But I would never take anything away from Emily's List. They can really put people on the map.
Absolutely. And you touched on it just a little bit there about donations and campaigning, and something that, again, I don't think I really realized. I understand a representative's term's only 2 years, but how, like, from day one, you're basically campaigning again or raising funds for the next year, and how that really impacted. Some of the women took that seriously and some of the women didn't in that class.
Definitely. I mean, I mentioned Katie Porter from Southern California. Again, she's like a powerhouse. She just raises tons of money. And they watch you. The party leadership in the House, they watch you. And if you're not raising any money, you're doing a bad job, and you're in a tough race, or you're not helping your colleagues out, they'll scold you. They'll come at you. That you're judged on that. At the same time, it is incredibly onerous. At one point, someone told me about a freshman. It wasn't one of the women. It was one of the men who was in a really, really tough fight. And they said, you know what? He's barely ever comes to his hearings because he's always across the street. At the committee, because you can't, you're not allowed to raise money on Capitol grounds. You're not allowed to do that. That's illegal. Right. That's a violation of campaign finance laws. So they have to physically leave the buildings and go across the street to the committees or someplace else, a library or something, to do that. And they said, this guy's always doing that, So money, look at this campaign that we're in now. It's just a wash in cash, millions and millions of dollars going into districts you could never even conceive of where that money goes. So that's a huge part of it. Nobody likes it. Some people are better at it than others. Some people, and people are, again, trying to approach it more from the small dollar way, raising online and so forth, which feels less onerous to them, and it makes them feel more connected to people who vote for them. But it is definitely a huge part of running, and it's a pill when you do have to go every 2 years.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and something I'm not sure our founders would have really foreseen, how insane it's really become.
Definitely.
Jeannie has a question. Do you think the decisiveness of Donald Trump presidency has attracted more women to get involved in Congress?
I definitely think that was the case. A lot of women stated that very specifically in 2018, that that they were upset specifically by Donald Trump, and that inspired them to run. And it's pretty interesting because historically, well, okay, so the beginning of the book does a lot of history, talking about, we just got we were just passed yesterday, I believe it was, the anniversary of women's suffrage, and Jeanette Rankin actually won in 1917, the year before. We had national right to women to vote, Republican woman. She was really a trailblazer, but for many years, most women in Congress were basically, the vast majority were either, were usually the wives of dead husbands. They were filling their seats, or they had some other family connection. And it took a long time, the 60s and 70s, before women started to really run on their own. And even then, it still was so much harder for women to be convinced. They had to usually have someone ask them to run. And that's something that's really changed. And I think you really saw a difference in 2018. And I don't have the precise numbers today. I was looking at them yesterday, but you had an even like a 40% increase in the number of women who won and made it through their primaries this year compared with 2018. Democrats and Republican women. More Democrats prevailed, but you just have so many more women every year now who are running.
That's amazing. Speaking of women, what is it like to be female in an institution that's built for and by males? There's single mothers you highlight in the book, nursing mothers. Can you just describe that experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If you think about the architecture, the space, the material culture of Capitol Hill, it has always historically been set up for men, and women have had to fight for their own gym. Just even in the 90s, they weren't permitted to go in the pool in the Senate. And finally, Kay Hagan, who was from North Carolina, said she loved to swim, and she said, "I want to know why we can't swim in the Senate pool." And it turned out that a lot of the male senators were swimming naked, so they had to change that rule. That was in the 90s. So they've been fighting these different battles. When I got to Congress in 2010, only in 2011 did they create a woman's bathroom off the floor of the House. Women had to go, kind of like leave the floor and go down the hall a little bit to a women's lounge. They just built that then. They took one of the committee rooms out. The Senate female bathroom only had 2 stalls until about 8 years ago, and they finally increased that. So that's kind of the space. But I have to say, it is really interesting. And women were in this class said, why is the congressional schedule set up the way it is? It really should be set up more, around school calendars with spring breaks and so forth. They were really pushing for things like that. But it was really interesting. Obviously, when Tammy Duckworth, the senator from Illinois, had a baby, they had to pass legislation just to allow her to bring the baby onto the floor of the Senate. And a lot of the men grumbled about that. But then a couple of years later, just I think it was about last year, Jamie Herrera Butler, a Republican from the West Coast, she had, I think, her 3rd child. And I saw her nurse the baby on the House floor, and I was blown away. I couldn't have imagined that 10 years prior. And also, women weren't allowed to wear sleeveless dresses on the House floor. That got changed. Democratic and Republican women said that's ridiculous and got that changed. But this is a lot of this is just stuff in my decade in Washington. So you can imagine what it was like, in the early 1900s with the few women here and there that were in Congress.
Yeah, such a vast difference in such a short amount of time.
Yes.
Moving to more policy issues, you talk a lot about Israel and Representative Ilhan Omar and how she kind of became a lightning rod for controversy. How did that all play out behind the scenes?
It was interesting. Ilhan Omar was interesting to watch her pretty fast evolution. When she got to Congress, she was very excited and very approachable and very open, and really, I think, thought she was going to make a lot of changes representing her community in Minneapolis. She's from the Somali refugee community. I think she was excited to be in the Foreign Relations Committee. As a refugee, she saw a lot of hope and excitement around being one of the first of 2 Muslim women to first be in Congress. And one of the first things that she did early on was challenge the relationship between United States and Israel, foreign policy, as well as openly challenging the power of AIPAC, the lobbying group on behalf of Israel. Now, I should say two things about that. One is that always in Congress, Democrats and Republicans have been pretty united, almost uniformly united on support of Israel and sort of no questions asked. This has been a thing that's sort of a bedrock of U.S. policy, bipartisan. You never want to be seen as against Israel in any way. The questioning during the Netanyahu era of the Israeli government is something that we all have witnessed has played out within the Jewish community. You can't say it's refugees or Muslims or outside of the community who are leading that conversation. Truly, that's been a division somewhat with younger Jews, right? But certainly not exclusively, and there are younger Jews on both sides of that, but really very actively questioning AIPAC, questioning Netanyahu government, period. And she was representing those point of views. And, you know, these women are very much about taking to Twitter and kind of more irreverent and making policy statements there, which obviously many of their colleagues were not. And when she was questioning these policies, she would use language like she said, it's all about the Benjamins, you know, making implications about money. She more than once trafficked in language that to Jews, and not even just Jews, but certainly to Jews and her Jewish colleagues, they saw right away as these anti-Semitic tropes. And this became a huge battle because it happened more than once on her Twitter and in some public speeches, some policy speeches that she gave off campus and so forth. Now, it was interesting for me to watch while I was reporting the book in a couple ways. One is how much all that scrutiny closed her down. She became much less effervescent, much less open. She would run away. Once I went to Minneapolis to watch her there. I went twice. The second time I was there, she literally didn't speak to me, even though I trailed her for 48 hours. Her press person is Jewish. And I watched him struggle with what he truly believed was her lack of understanding of this language. He would say, look, she grew up in a Somali community. She's not, you know, she didn't grow up around Jews. She doesn't realize these things. His true belief and in the need to defend her and his passionate belief that, but also even hearing from his own family, hey, what's going on here with your boss? You know, I could really see his torment around it. So that was interesting in terms of behind the scenes and some things that I saw. But what I will say also is that even though what ultimately happened with Ilhan Omar is that she ended up being led by Nancy Pelosi, publicly rebuked, you know, on the House floor, and it became a not great incident for her, she still sparked a conversation that Rashida Tlaib, who's from Michigan, who's Palestinian, did not join in with that language, but certainly shared her points of view, and were talking to their colleagues about those points of view in ways that you didn't really see in Congress before. So I do think that they had an impact on the conversation. And I will also say, finally on that, one of her biggest critics was Eliot Engel, who was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He didn't want her in that committee. He certainly took a lot of issues with her language, complained to the speaker, you know, was very much joining with Republicans and rebuking her. Eliot Engel is not coming back to the next Congress, and Ilhan Omar is. He lost a primary to a much more progressive Democrat who was probably more in step with his changing district in New York. And I say that not to say Ilhan Omar defeated Eliot Engel. I don't mean to suggest that at all. But what I'm saying is that there are changes within the Jewish community. There are changes within Americans' views of some of these issues. And there's a change in the conversation, and it's just more dynamic at this point.
You touched on it a little bit with Omar about social media, Twitter, Instagram. A lot of these campaigns were run on more of an organic social media, you know, not top down, more bottom up. But it's also interesting, you note that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, that she really got the ear of the media, like the mainstream media, and she really got to use that. That's very unlike most freshman Congress people. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, people didn't see her victory coming. The guy that she'd run against had been in Congress a long time. In fact, he was on the short list for Speaker, Joe Crowley. He kind of didn't clue in leadership in how much trouble he was actually in. So I think people kind of slept on that. And it was a pretty low turnout race, you know. She also benefited greatly. One of the things I like to point out about that race that I think people don't realize is that he actually won a lot of the more heavily Black and Latino neighborhoods, and she won the white gentrifying neighborhoods in Queens, where a lot of new, younger millennial voters who were really excited by her. And that's something people don't necessarily realize, but that was how that went down. And so she was right away an object of fascination and curiosity, because she'd beaten, you know, this powerhouse. And who was she? And oh my God, she's the youngest woman who's ever going to be in Congress. And what's that all about? And she's very, you know, beautiful and vibrant, and she plays video games, and she's on Twitter. And it was just very, different. And the media loves something that's different. And she, I would also say that, and I was watching this today, as a matter of fact, with her, Republicans were criticizing her for being on a fancy magazine with expensive clothes, you know, that she doesn't get to keep. And she started hitting them back right away and saying, Republican Party, get a grip. This is a fake thing. And that's another way that she used social media that was very different, is hitting back, taking on her criticism head on, posting videos of herself dancing and confronting people. And that was just something that was really different. And I think just really surprised people in the media, and they were enticed by it. Thank you. So I think that was just something that some of her colleagues tried to emulate, but they never really kind of got it the way she does.
That leads us right into Nancy's question. Do you believe that the Vanity Fair photo shoot will affect AOC negatively in her re-election bid?
Oh, not at all. I mean, that's a safe Democratic seat. I don't see her having any problem there at all. And I'm glad that you saw that photo shoot for the purposes of our conversation, because I wasn't sure how many people had seen this, because this was just kind of brand new. But, you know, everything that she does, by and large, I think mostly what it does, whether it's playing video games, you know, with a bunch of young voters and talking about voting the whole time, or making videos of her, or being on Instagram and putting her, you know, IKEA furniture together and talking about policy while she does that, or hitting back people, her critics. I think what that mostly does is just invigorate her fan base. I don't think it increases her detractors at all. They exist from day one. When she was sworn in, they booed. She was the only one they did that to on the House floor when they got sworn in 2019, that January. So her detractors have always been there, and they've used her as the symbol of the Democratic Party, the entire squad, but especially her. She sort of replaced Nancy Pelosi as their symbol. And so she's definitely has her detractors, but I don't think they grow in numbers as much as her supporters. From what I've observed, their support of her just becomes more fermented, I think.
Thank you. I'm just going to remind you, if you have questions, to put them in either the Q&A or the chat. If you want to pick up a copy of the Inside Story of the Women Reshaping Congress, that's signed by Jennifer, the link is in our chat. You mentioned AOC building her IKEA furniture, and you talk about this in the book as well. You know, what lifestyle what is a typical day for one of these women like in Congress?
Oh gosh, different than you would expect. The one thing I think that really shocks people when they get elected to Congress is how little control they have over their schedule. So they might get up in the morning. I'd say the most ambitious of them get up and go to the gym. If that's maybe where they first start their day. But they usually have a breakfast meeting with constituents. And these meetings, a lot of times too, come like in half hour or even 15-minute blocks, where you're meeting with, you know, not necessarily, a lot of times it's just their staff, but it is them sometimes meeting with elected, you know, people from the district, constituents, people, mayors, you know, people with businesses there. They'll meet with industry groups, you know, 1 minute after the next. Then they have hearings. The way that this is another thing that they said, why do we do it this way? You were asking about things that have always been done a certain way. They have hearings mostly in the morning, and they're simultaneous. So they might actually be on two committees where they have to run from one hearing room to the next. They might have overlapping hearings. So they'll go, and when it's their turn, they go in order of seniority when they ask questions. So when they're done asking their questions, they might run off to their next hearing or even to a meeting. Then they might run across the street for an hour and make phone calls to raise money or have lunch with somebody. And then they have to run across over to the Capitol and vote. And, that might be an hour out of the day. And then they run back, and then they have another meeting. And by the time it's dinner time, they usually are going to a fundraiser or an event with a group that's, supporting them or is of interest to them. And they'll usually have, dinner off of like the cocktail table, and then go back to their apartments and usually read briefing paper. The best of them who are prepared, we usually read briefing papers until 10 or 11 o'clock at night to prepare for the next day. It's not a leisurely job.
I was gonna say, not for the weak or the or the lazy, for sure.
And that's people have this myth that they don't do anything all day, or when they go back to their districts, they're kind of like just watching football or something. Back in the districts, it's the same kind of thing. Running to the meetings are longer. They'll maybe go run to a hospital, and I've watched them. I've gone with them. They'll have maybe an hour there where they'll tour the hospital and then meet with the executives there, and then they'll go to an airport and learn all about the local airport, and then those go to a trash site and learn about their infrastructure needs and things like that. Go to Girl Scouts. Go to like local chamber of commerce. So that's also home. Tons of meetings too. It's a highly scheduled, really hard charging job.
And one of the other things that you mentioned just briefly is in part of their orientation is how they set up their staff. Like, you can really do it however. And I think it was AOC who really had this dilemma between like paying people a fair way. Like, do you pay your interns or do you not pay them and give everyone better health insurance? And those are not regular. I mean, that's really up to each individual congressperson to decide.
Yeah, that's something that Donna Shalala, who'd been around the block, again, she'd been a cabinet secretary, she'd been a university president, and here she was in her 70s, a freshman in Congress, and she said she thought that was kind of the weirdest thing, that there was no guidance in how you set up your office. It's like, I can hire 3 people and pay them a ton of money. I can hire 20 people and pay them all a little bit of money. I can have a person in this role and that role. It's really up to the individual member. She did it really differently because she sort of set the stage for wanting to pay interns. And so how she managed that is she had the highest salary in her office, the chief of staff, I think, pretty low paid. Now, he happened to be independently wealthy, so that worked out. But, people in Congress have been arguing about fair wages for a long time because these staffers are pretty not well paid for how expensive Washington is. And this has been a real battle for a long time. Having wages that can be affordable in the District of Columbia region. But yeah, there's no uniform way to do it. And it is at their discretion. But I will say, and not just in Congress, kind of the era of the unpaid intern, an internship on Capitol Hill is really prestigious and everybody wants that, especially those summer internships. But I think that it's becoming more and more untenable not to pay interns, and for no other reason than you can only attract these young people who can afford to have summer jobs that are not paid, and you're just really limiting your talent pool and your opportunities when you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I attended college in DC, and I definitely felt the same thing. You either had to have a second job if you took the unpaid internship where you're getting these great skills because the internships just were not able to pay you.
Yes.
You mentioned it briefly. Chrissy Houlihan represents some of us here in the 6th district. She has part of half of the county that we're in as the Pennsylvania 6th. And she is part of the so-called badasses who have that military or national security background. They were really instrumental in leading the impeachment of President Trump. Can you explain why that group really took the lead on that issue?
Yeah, so you may remember that right when they got to Congress, after they were sworn in, Rashida Tlaib infamously went to a rally with a liberal group, I think it was Move On, and announced that they were going to impeach Trump. And it was really upsetting to her colleagues because they're like, hey, we just got here, we don't want to run on doing that, especially these people, again, who won in Republican districts, which includes Chrissy Houlihan. As you know, she did beat a Republican. And so that was not a winning message for them. And they were not interested in necessarily engaging on that. They wanted to work on healthcare and other issues. And of course, oppose the administration, but that wasn't a goal because it was a net negative for them. It didn't poll well. It wasn't a great thing for them to be focused on. Voters didn't want that. But when the Ukraine situation became public, these women and some of the male veterans too that were part of that class started literally texting. They have a text chain and saying, what do you think about that? Did you see that? Oh my goodness, this really feels different. And they felt really compelled at that point that it was them in the national security interest and in the ethics of, the White House, the president, of the office of president, that they felt like they couldn't look away from that. It was their opinion that had crossed the line. And they wrote an op-ed. They gave Nancy Pelosi a heads up, of course. They sent it to her. She read it on an airplane. I think she also lost it on the airplane. She left it on the plane afterwards or something, but they let her know. And they wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post advocating for that. And it was, I think, a real turning point because of their background, being more the moderate members, not being like, hey, the most progressive people, let's go attack the president, let's impeach the president. But because of their national security credentials, they gave a lot of credibility to that argument and gave a lot of their colleagues comfort that they were in the right place to go ahead and advocate along with them for what ultimately, as you all know, became impeachment proceedings in the House.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Congresswomen such as Katie Porter often bring a different outlook and set of skills to their job. Katie Porter's famous for her whiteboard for explaining things. What are those outlook and skill sets, and how are they going to affect Congress in the future?
Well, we talked about AOC and her use to social media, and then you mentioned Katie Porter, who was a law professor and actually trained under Elizabeth Warren, and her whiteboards and her professorial style. And we talk about a lot of the women in hearings who bring sort of their boardroom experience or the way they conducted themselves in the military and so forth, and the way they question witnesses and everything. I think those professional experiences do animate the way they do their job, certainly in oversight. I think their backgrounds also have a lot of policy implications, big and small. I'll give you one example, since we were talking about the badasses being on the Armed Services Committee. They were pushing for legislation that would, it's very complicated, but to try to make it as simple as possible, it would be having more legal oversight outside of the military in sexual assault cases at the military academies. And most people have never gotten anywhere with that. But I think because these were female veterans, some of whom had attended these elite service academies, they were able to bring a lot more credibility to that issue, and ultimately that amendment passed with Republican support, and it had not before, and it probably was not going to until they spoke about it. So I think their professional backgrounds, their credibility, their skills in being able to question witnesses, and their commitment to either the expertise they already have or to really boning up on issues has really served them well, and it does make Congress function better and makes, I would say, more credibility to some of those processes.
Just a reminder, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A or raise your hand and we can unmute you. So what is the actual impact of the increasing number of women in Congress? And do you think it's going to have a lasting effect?
Well, I kind of concluded in the book that probably the greatest impact of the 116th Congress was more the diversity. Because I mean that by the professional diversity that we were just discussing, but also, and even when we're talking about issues of Israel, issues that are important to communities where you have high rates of incarceration that may not have had people representing them that had a lot of interest in that. I think about the Lauren Underwood really championing a caucus that was focused on maternal death among Black women. These are issues that they're focused on that make an impact. In terms of women, I just kind of don't think you can say, first of all, women like men vote party before gender. You know, people stick with their party mostly. It's not like women are all together. It's different in the 70s when women had far less power in Congress. Republicans and Democrats realized they had to come together as women to get things done, to have some policy influence. That's quite different now for a whole lot of reasons. But I think you just need to have more women to say that, to really judge the impact. And I look at the Nevada legislature, which is barely, but it is majority women. And they immediately did a lot of stuff like make sure that all police departments had rape test kits and things like that, you know, not partisan things at all. And it's not that men necessarily didn't care about those things, but they wouldn't have made it a priority. And when you just have a majority of women, they start to legislate through different priority sets sometimes.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Looking ahead to Tuesday, our next election, you said that most of these women's seats should be secure, hopefully safe for them. But what do you think, is the class for the 117th Congress? Like, are there more women, more diverse candidates in general, whether or not they win? Has the last election really impacted who's running in the 2020 election?
It definitely made women in both parties run more. There were more of them. The Republican women were not as successful as the Democratic women because Republican women have a hard time getting through primaries. When women in both parties get through their primaries, they win general elections at the same rate as men. Primaries tends to be their wall, and as I said, it's harder for Republican women. So there were just more of them. You might see a few other firsts, but not necessarily, but you may also see a few more women generally. And as I said before, in any places where Democrats may lose to Republicans, it looks like those would be Republican women replacing them. And that would be important to them because not only did they lose ground in 2018, but they've had some retirements among some of the women as well. So they're looking to gain ground there. And I do have a sense that, a lot of things in politics are pendulums, but I do think that this is really held out, that women, we're just going to see more and more and more women running because they're finding the mechanisms of support to do so. And they're finding, if they use this class as a model, they're finding a lot of support in their communities from other women, but not exclusively other women. And they've been able to really maintain connections to their constituents that have kept them in power. And I'm sure that that will inspire other women as well.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to just remind you once again, the book is called The First. There's a link in the chat. Did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to bring up, Jennifer?
I just want to emphasize what I said before, that a lot of times I think when I was doing these talks right after Elizabeth Warren lost, and then of course not so long ago on the heels of Hillary Clinton's loss, there was this sensation that women can't win. And we'll see on Tuesday whether we have the first female vice president. She would be a first on a lot of levels. Obviously, as a Black woman with East Asian background. And also, I always like to point out, I think she'd be the first Generation X as well. So we'll see a lot of firsts in her if that happens. That could lead to other cabinet members that might be the first females in those positions. So women shouldn't be discouraged. Women in both parties can and do win. And I really think it's important that one of the biggest takeaways I had and one of the biggest impacts, it kind of sounds like a Hallmark card, but I really observed it myself, is that when young women and young girls and young women look out onto the floor of Congress, and right now it's mostly obviously looking to the right where the Democrats sit, they see women and they see women who look like them, and they understand that they can do that. And that's not a small thing. It's not insignificant. It's not just kind of something sweet. It's actually impactful. I've seen that spark go. And I just encourage women to run, and to encourage your daughters, your grandchildren, run for something. You don't have to run for Congress. You can run for the school board. You can run for all kinds of office. But truly, I just think all people should encourage women, run for something, because you'll win.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for participating in Literature Berks. I wish everyone a good evening, and please remember to vote on Tuesday. It's really important.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody. Good night.